The grey sky hung low over the small cemetery, casting a somber shadow over the mourners gathered around the freshly dug grave. The wind carried a faint chill, rustling the leaves of the nearby oaks and causing coats to pull tighter around the shoulders of the crowd. Emma Carter, standing near the back, adjusted her scarf as she observed the scene. She had been in this town for only a few weeks, a transfer from the bustling city to what was supposed to be a quieter post. But today, even the calm air of the town felt heavy. The funeral was for Michael Reeves, a man the locals spoke of with fondness. He'd been a generous figure in the community, always ready to lend a hand or offer advice. His sudden death from an apparent heart attack had shocked everyone. Near the front of the group, 3 dogs sat silently by the casket. Thor, Luna, and Rex were an unusual sight at such a solemn event. The 3 were Michael's companions, and their presence had been allowed out of respect for the bond they shared. Thor, the largest of the trio, a German shepherd, sat upright, his amber eyes scanning the crowd as though standing guard. Luna, a sleek black Labrador, stayed closer to the casket, her nose occasionally sniffing the air. Rex, the smallest of the 3, a stocky, determined-looking terrier, paced back and forth, his restlessness drawing glances from the mourners. "They won't leave his side," someone whispered nearby. Emma's gaze lingered on the dogs. There was something about their behavior that unsettled her. While they appeared calm at first glance, their subtle movements told a different story. Thor's ears twitched at the slightest noise, Luna's tail remained rigid, and Rex's pacing grew more frantic as the service progressed. The pastor's voice carried through the air as he delivered the eulogy, but Emma found it difficult to focus. Her eyes were drawn back to the dogs, whose attention now seemed fixed on the grave itself. As the ceremony came to an end, mourners began to disperse, offering quiet condolences to Michael's remaining relatives. A few lingered, glancing nervously at the dogs, who had yet to move from their positions. Emma approached the cemetery caretaker, an older man with a weathered face and a kind demeanor. "Have they been like this the whole time?" she asked, nodding toward the dogs. "Since the moment they brought the casket in," he replied, scratching his head. "Never seen anything like it. It's almost as if they're trying to tell us something." Emma frowned. It was an odd choice of words, but she couldn't deny the same feeling had crossed her mind. Later that afternoon, Emma lingered near the cemetery gates, her curiosity refusing to let her leave. Most of the mourners had gone, but Thor, Luna, and Rex remained. They stood by the grave, unmoving, even as the gravediggers began to shovel dirt over the casket. As the last mound of soil was patted down, Rex suddenly began to dig. His small paws kicked up dirt furiously, his barking sharp and insistent. Thor joined in, his powerful claws making quick work of the freshly packed earth. Luna stood nearby, barking in rhythm with the others. "What in the world?" one of the gravediggers exclaimed, dropping his shovel. "Get those dogs out of here," another shouted. But no one dared to approach them. The intensity in the dogs' eyes, the way they moved with purpose, was enough to give anyone pause. Emma stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Wait, don't touch them." The gravediggers hesitated, looking at her with uncertainty. "I'm Officer Carter," she added, pulling out her badge. "Let me handle this." Emma knelt a few feet away from the dogs, trying to gauge their behavior. Thor growled low in his throat, a warning not meant for her but for anyone who might interfere. "Easy, boy," she murmured, holding out a hand. "What are you trying to show us?" Thor paused his digging, his piercing eyes meeting hers. For a brief moment, Emma felt a chill run down her spine. There was an intelligence in his gaze that went beyond instinct. Rex barked again, returning to his frantic work. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the caretaker approached Emma. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Emma shook her head. "No, I don't think they will. Should we open it?" Emma hesitated. The very idea seemed absurd, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the dogs were onto something. She glanced back at Thor, Luna, and Rex, now sitting in a semicircle around the disturbed grave. Their barking had stopped, replaced by low whines that tugged at her chest. "Let's wait until morning," she said finally. "I'll stay and keep an eye on them." The caretaker nodded reluctantly, leaving Emma alone with the dogs as the cemetery fell silent. The night was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Emma sat on a nearby bench, her flashlight resting in her lap. Thor, Luna, and Rex remained by the grave, their eyes unblinking as they stared at the freshly turned earth. "What are you trying to tell me?" Emma whispered into the darkness. The dogs didn't move, but their presence was answer enough. Something was wrong. The first rays of dawn crept over the cemetery. painting the gravestones in hues of gold and grey. Emma hadn't slept. She'd spent the night sitting on the cold bench, her flashlight clutched tightly in her hand, watching Thor, Luna, and Rex maintain their silent vigil near Michael's grave. The early morning air was crisp, and the quiet felt heavy, almost unnatural. Thor lay stretched out near the grave, his ears twitching with each sound. Luna sat upright, her eyes fixed on the mound of dirt, while Rex occasionally let out a soft whimper, circling the area as though searching for something. Emma's back ached from the uncomfortable position she'd held for hours, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. There was a gravity to the dog's behavior that kept her rooted to the spot. Around 7 a.m., the caretaker returned, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "They're still here?" he asked, glancing at the dogs. Emma nodded, standing to stretch her legs. "They haven't moved much. It's like they're guarding something or trying to tell us something's wrong." The caretaker scratched his head, his weathered face creased with unease. "In all my years working here, I've never seen anything like this. I don't know what to make of it." Emma's eyes drifted to the grave. "Neither do I, but we can't ignore it." As more people began to arrive at the cemetery for their morning routines, whispers of the dog's strange behavior spread quickly. A few visitors stopped to watch, their curiosity piqued by the sight of the three animals standing sentinel over Michael's grave. One woman, an elderly neighbor of Michael's, approached Emma cautiously. "Officer, I've known Michael for years," the woman said, clutching a worn handbag. "Those dogs, they were his world. He used to say they were smarter than most people he knew. If they're acting this way, it's not for nothing." Emma nodded, taking the woman's words to heart. She turned her attention back to the dogs, who had resumed their digging with renewed vigor. Rex, the smallest of the three, barked sharply, his paws working furiously to uncover something buried just beneath the surface. Thor and Luna joined him, their movements synchronized and purposeful. Emma's stomach twisted with unease. Finally, she stepped closer, her voice firm yet gentle. "All right, that's enough," she said, holding out her hands as if to calm them. "Let me see what you found." The dogs hesitated, their bodies tense before stepping back reluctantly. The fresh hole they had created was shallow but revealing. At first, Emma thought it was just a piece of torn fabric sticking out from the dirt, but as she reached down and brushed away the soil, she realized it was something else entirely. A key. It was old and slightly rusted, with intricate engravings along its edges. Attached to it was a small weathered tag with faint letters etched into the metal. "Cabin." Emma's heart quickened. She held the key up to the light, examining it closely. "What were you trying to show me?" she murmured, glancing at the dogs. Thor let out a low whine, nudging her hand gently with his nose. The discovery only deepened the mystery. Why would a key be buried near Michael's grave, and why were the dogs so determined to uncover it? Emma's mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. She decided to take the key with her, slipping it into her jacket pocket. The dogs followed her closely as she walked toward her car, their behavior shifting from urgency to quiet determination. "You're not going to let me do this alone, are you?" Emma asked, glancing down at Thor, who trotted faithfully by her side. His intense gaze felt like an answer. Back at the station, Emma began digging through public records, hoping to find any mention of a cabin connected to Michael Reeves. It didn't take long. Michael had owned a small property on the outskirts of town, a secluded cabin he'd purchased years ago, though he rarely spoke of it. The discovery made Emma's pulse quicken. She jotted down the address and prepared to leave, but as she turned toward the door, she found herself face to face with her supervisor, Captain Miller. "Carter," he said, his tone clipped. "What's this I hear about you poking around Michael Reeves's grave?" Emma hesitated. "The dogs. They found something. A key. It led me to a property Michael owned. A cabin. I think it might be connected to his death." Miller frowned, crossing his arms. "Michael died of a heart attack. It's a closed case. Don't waste your time chasing shadows." "With all due respect, sir," Emma said, her voice steady, "I don't think this is a coincidence. Something's not adding up, and I have to follow this lead." Miller sighed, clearly unimpressed, but he didn't stop her as she walked past him, the dogs trailing behind. By the time Emma reached the cabin later that afternoon, the sun was beginning to set. The property was nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. The cabin itself was small and weathered, its wooden exterior showing signs of age and neglect. Emma parked her car and stepped out cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of life. The dogs moved ahead of her, their noses to the ground as they sniffed the air. "All right, let's see what we find," Emma muttered, clutching the key tightly in her hand. Thor barked once, his tail wagging as he approached the cabin's door. It was locked, but the key slid into the rusty lock with ease. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior filled with dust and cobwebs. Emma stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with a single table, a few chairs, and a cot in the corner. But it was what sat on the table that caught her attention, a stack of papers neatly arranged with Michael's name scrawled across the top. Her breath caught in her throat. "What were you hiding, Michael?" she whispered, her fingers brushing over the papers. Behind her, the dogs stood guard, their ears perked and their eyes watchful. The papers on the cabin table were yellowed and worn, as though they had been sitting undisturbed for years. Emma sifted through them carefully, her heart pounding as she scanned the contents. The first few pages appeared to be handwritten letters, though much of the writing was faded and difficult to read. One, however, caught her attention immediately. "If you're reading this, it means I couldn't stop them. They've been watching me and I fear for my life. If anything happens to me, please find the evidence I've hidden. It's the only way to expose them." The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Michael Reeves. Emma swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. She glanced over her shoulder at the dogs who sat silently near the door, their eyes fixed on her, as if waiting for her to act. "What were you afraid of, Michael?" she whispered, turning back to the table. Beneath the letters were maps and documents that appeared to detail transactions involving a local business magnate, Robert Grayson. Emma recognized the name immediately. Grayson was one of the wealthiest men in the county, known for his philanthropic contributions and influence in the community. But according to these papers, he had been involved in something far darker: money laundering, land theft, and most disturbingly, forced disappearances. Michael's notes were meticulous, connecting Grayson to several unsolved cases in the area. The more Emma read, the clearer it became. Michael hadn't died of a heart attack. He had been silenced. Her breath hitched as she came across a hand-drawn map. It marked a location deep in the woods, not far from the cabin. Scrawled next to it in Michael's handwriting were the words, "The truth is buried here." Emma carefully folded the papers and tucked them into her bag. As she moved toward the door, she felt a sudden chill. The dogs were still sitting by the entrance, but their ears were perked, their bodies tense. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thor let out a low growl, his gaze locked on the window. Emma turned her flashlight toward the glass but saw nothing outside, just the dense forest shrouded in twilight. Still, the unease in her chest grew. She stepped outside, the dogs flanking her on either side, their presence reassuring but also heightening her sense of urgency. "We're not alone out here," she muttered, scanning the tree line. Thor barked sharply, breaking the silence. The sound echoed through the woods, but no response came. Emma decided not to linger. Whatever, or whoever, was watching, she couldn't let it stop her. Returning to the cemetery felt like the right move. The location marked on the map was close to where Michael had been buried, and Emma suspected it wasn't a coincidence. As she drove, the dogs sat calmly in the back seat, their eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if they understood the importance of the mission. By the time she reached the cemetery, the sun had fully set, leaving the area bathed in darkness. Emma parked her car near the gate and stepped out, her flashlight slicing through the shadows. The graveyard was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound feel amplified. Thor, Luna, and Rex immediately took the lead, their noses to the ground as they guided her through the rows of graves. Emma followed closely, clutching her bag tightly. They stopped near Michael's grave, but instead of focusing on the mound of dirt, the dogs turned their attention to a cluster of trees nearby. Thor barked once, then began to dig furiously at the base of one of the largest oaks. Luna and Rex quickly joined him, their paws kicking up dirt with relentless determination. Emma's pulse quickened. She dropped to her knees, using her hands to help uncover whatever was buried there. After several minutes of digging, her fingers hit something solid. She brushed away the dirt, revealing a small metal box rusted with age. "What is this?" she murmured, pulling it free. The box was locked, but the key she had found earlier fit perfectly. With a click, the lid popped open, revealing a stack of photographs and a small USB drive. The photographs were grainy but clear enough to make out the subjects: Robert Grayson and several other men Emma recognized as prominent figures in the town, standing in front of what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse. The USB drive was labeled with a single word: proof. Emma's mind raced. If the evidence on this drive was as damning as she suspected, it could not only expose Grayson, but also explain why Michael had been targeted. She glanced at the dogs, who sat quietly now, their work done. "You knew, didn't you?" she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You knew exactly where to lead me." Thor wagged his tail faintly, his intense gaze never wavering. Emma stood, tucking the box into her bag. She knew she had to act quickly. Whatever was on the USB drive would undoubtedly put a target on her back, just as it had on Michael's. But she wasn't alone. The dogs had proven their loyalty and intelligence time and time again, and Emma felt a renewed sense of determination. As she made her way back to the car, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The answers she sought were within reach, but so was the danger that came with them. Back in the car, Emma plugged the USB drive into her laptop, her hands trembling slightly. The files it contained were extensive: financial records, emails, and surveillance footage that directly implicated Robert Grayson in a series of illegal activities, including Michael's supposed death. Her breath caught as she opened the final file, a video. The footage showed Michael, alive but visibly shaken, speaking directly into the camera. "If you're watching this, it means I've failed to stop them," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "But I trust my friends to lead you to the truth. Please, don't let my story end here." Emma closed the laptop, her jaw tightening. She wouldn't let Michael down. The forest loomed tall and dense as Emma made her way down the narrow dirt path. The dogs led the way, their movements purposeful and coordinated, as if they'd walked this trail 100 times before. Thor, always vigilant, stayed slightly ahead, while Luna and Rex alternated between sniffing the ground and glancing back at Emma to make sure she was following. The map Michael had drawn was tucked into her pocket, but Emma hardly needed it. The dogs seemed to know exactly where to go. Their confidence gave her a strange sense of reassurance, though the weight of the USB drive and the photographs in her bag kept her on edge. The journey through the woods was slow and tense. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made Emma's pulse quicken. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Stay close, guys," she murmured, her voice low but steady. Thor's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, but he didn't stop. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to change. It grew heavier, the smell of damp earth mixing with something faintly metallic. Emma's flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing tree trunks that seemed to close in around them. Michael's notes mentioned a warehouse, she whispered to herself, her thoughts racing. This has to lead somewhere. Luna suddenly stopped, her body stiffening as a low growl escaped her throat. Rex crouched low, his ears pinned back. Thor moved to stand in front of Emma, his posture protective. "What is it?" Emma asked, gripping the flashlight tighter. Ahead, through the thick underbrush, the outline of a building began to take shape. It was large and rectangular, its walls weathered and covered in ivy. A faint light flickered through one of the windows, and Emma's stomach tightened. "This must be it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The group approached cautiously, the dogs staying close to Emma's side. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Emma crouched behind a fallen log to get a better look at the structure. The warehouse appeared abandoned, but the light suggested otherwise. "Looks like someone's home," she muttered. Thor let out a quiet huff, his eyes locked on the building. Emma took a deep breath, her mind racing through her options. She couldn't call for backup, not yet. If someone inside was connected to Grayson, alerting them would only give them time to cover their tracks. She pulled out her phone and snapped a photo of the warehouse, sending it to her personal email along with a quick note. Found the location from Michael's map. "Evidence inside? You ready for this, guys?" she asked, glancing at the dogs. Thor's steady gaze seemed to say, "Always." Emma crept closer, using the trees for cover as she approached the side of the building. The dogs moved silently beside her, their training, or perhaps their natural instincts, making them the perfect companions for this kind of operation. When they reached the side door, Emma tested the handle. It was locked, but the rusted metal gave her the impression it wouldn't take much to break. "Stay back," she whispered to the dogs. Thor, Luna, and Rex sat obediently, their eyes fixed on her as she worked to pry the door open. After a few tense moments, the lock gave way with a loud snap. Emma winced at the noise, her heart pounding as she pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, with long shadows stretching across the concrete floor. Stacks of crates and metal shelving lined the walls, and the faint hum of machinery echoed through the space. In the center of the room, a single chair sat under a bare light bulb, and on that chair, Emma's breath caught. "Michael," she whispered. Michael Reeves sat slumped in the chair, his wrists bound and his head hanging low. His clothes were dirty and torn, and his face was pale, but his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Emma's first instinct was to run to him, but the dogs stiffened beside her, their ears perked and their bodies tense. Luna let out a soft growl, and Emma realized why. She wasn't alone in the warehouse. A figure stepped out from behind one of the shelves, a man in his 40s with a lean build and cold eyes. He carried a gun loosely in one hand, his posture casual but his expression deadly serious. "I was wondering when someone would come snooping around," the man said, his voice calm but menacing. Emma's mind raced. She didn't recognize him, but his presence here confirmed her suspicions. Michael's death had been no accident. "Let him go," she said, stepping into the room with her hands raised slightly. "It's over." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "You think it's that simple? Grayson doesn't leave loose ends, and neither do I." Thor growled low in his throat, and the man's eyes flicked to the dogs. "Call them off," he said, raising the gun. Emma's jaw tightened. "I don't think so." In a flash, Thor lunged, his powerful body knocking the man off balance before he could react. The gun clattered to the floor as Luna and Rex joined in, their combined force overwhelming him in seconds. Emma rushed forward, grabbing the gun and training it on the man as he struggled under the dog's grip. "Stay down," she commanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The man stopped struggling, his breath ragged as the dogs kept him pinned. Emma moved quickly to Michael's side, untying his wrists and helping him to his feet. His eyes fluttered open and he stared at her in confusion. "Emma?" he rasped. "It's okay," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're safe now." Thor, Luna, and Rex finally backed off, their job done. Emma secured the man with his own restraints before turning her attention back to Michael. "We need to get out of here," she said, helping him toward the door. As they stepped into the cool night air, Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she knew the fight wasn't over yet. The forest was eerily silent as Emma helped Michael out of the warehouse. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he pushed forward with quiet determination, leaning heavily on her for support. Thor, Luna, and Rex flanked them, their heads swiveling as they scanned the shadows for any sign of danger. "You're going to be okay," Emma assured Michael, her voice steady. "We'll get you to safety." Michael winced as he tried to speak, his voice hoarse. They'll come after us. Grayson doesn't leave loose ends." Emma tightened her grip on his arm. "Not if I stop them first." The group moved quickly, weaving through the trees toward Emma's car parked just beyond the forest edge. The dogs led the way, their bodies tense and alert. Emma's heart raced with every step, the weight of the man she was supporting only matched by the weight of the evidence she carried in her bag. "Who was that man?" she asked quietly, hoping to keep Michael conscious and talking. Michael coughed, his voice barely above a whisper. "One of Grayson's men. He's been watching me for weeks. I thought I could outrun them, but they got to me before I could." "Before you could what?" "Get the evidence to someone I trusted," he finished, his breath hitching. "The dogs, I hoped they'd lead someone to the truth." Emma's chest tightened. "They did. They found me." Michael managed a faint smile, his head dipping slightly. As the car came into view, Emma felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The crack of a branch behind them made her freeze in place, her blood running cold. "Down!" she hissed, pulling Michael behind a tree. Thor, Luna, and Rex immediately took defensive positions, their growls low and threatening. Emma crouched, peering around the trunk to spot the source of the noise. A second man, armed and moving swiftly, was approaching from the direction of the warehouse. His silhouette was barely visible in the fading light, but the glint of his weapon was unmistakable. Emma's mind raced. They couldn't outrun him with Michael in his weakened state, and they couldn't afford to be caught. "Stay here," she whispered to Michael, easing him down to the ground. She motioned to the dogs. "Thor, Luna, Rex, stay with him. Guard him." Thor let out a soft bark of understanding, his posture firm as he stood protectively over Michael. Emma crept through the underbrush, keeping low to the ground. Her hand tightened around the gun she'd taken from the first man, its cold weight reassuring in her grip. She waited until the armed man was closer, her heart pounding in her chest. When he was within range, Emma stepped out from behind a tree, her gun raised. "Drop your weapon," she commanded, her voice sharp and unwavering. The man froze, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her. "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Emma didn't waver. The only mistake was thinking you could get away with this. Before he could respond, a blur of black and tan shot out from the underbrush. Thor lunged at the man with incredible speed, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's arm. The weapon fell to the ground with a clatter as the man cried out in pain. Luna and Rex followed, their combined efforts forcing the man to the ground. Emma moved quickly, kicking the weapon out of reach and securing the man with the same restraints she had used earlier. "You really should have stayed in the shadows," she muttered, pulling him to his feet. Thor stood close, his growls rumbling low in his throat as a warning. Once the second man was secured, Emma returned to Michael, who was still slumped against the tree. His face was pale, but his eyes opened as she approached. "Is it over?" he rasped. "For now," Emma replied, helping him to his feet once more. The group finally reached the car, and Emma quickly loaded Michael into the back seat. The dogs jumped in after him, Thor taking a position beside him as if to keep watch. Emma got behind the wheel, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she started the engine. The drive back to town felt agonizingly slow, every shadow on the road a potential threat. "You're safe now," Emma said, glancing at Michael in the rearview mirror. "We have everything we need to bring them down." Michael's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of hope in them. "Thank you," he said weakly. Emma nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Thank the dogs. They're the real heroes." Back at the station, Emma made sure Michael received immediate medical attention. The evidence she'd gathered, the USB drive, the photographs, the documents, was locked securely in her desk. She didn't trust anyone else with it, not until she could make sure the information got into the right hands. As Michael was taken to the hospital, Emma sat in her office with the dogs lying at her feet. The exhaustion of the night finally began to sink in, but she knew the fight wasn't over yet. Grayson's reach was long, and his power in the community was vast. But Emma had something he didn't: the truth, and 3 loyal dogs who wouldn't let her down. She reached down to scratch Thor behind the ears, a small smile breaking through her tired expression. "We're not done yet," she said softly. Thor wagged his tail, his steady gaze giving her the reassurance she needed. The morning after the rescue, Emma stood in the station's conference room staring at the evidence spread across the table. The photographs, the documents, and the contents of the USB drive painted a damning picture of Robert Grayson and his criminal enterprise. Each piece fit together to form a story of corruption, greed, and violence, one that had gone unchecked for far too long. Michael's video confession was the centerpiece, his trembling words a direct plea for justice. Emma took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She had everything she needed to bring Grayson down. The challenge now was ensuring that the evidence reached someone who could act on it before Grayson's network had a chance to cover their tracks. The dogs, Thor, Luna, and Rex, sat quietly nearby, their watchful eyes fixed on her. "You 3 have done more for this case than half the department," Emma said, her voice tinged with gratitude. Thor tilted his head, his tail wagging faintly. Later that day, Emma met with Captain Miller in his office. She had prepared carefully, anticipating resistance, but she refused to back down. "This is everything," Emma said, placing the file on his desk. "Proof that Michael was targeted, proof that Grayson orchestrated the entire thing. We can't let this go." Miller leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he flipped through the file. "This is a lot," he said finally, his tone cautious. "If this is true, Grayson's reach extends further than we thought." "It's true," Emma insisted, "and we can't let fear stop us from doing the right thing." Miller sighed, rubbing his temples. "You realize what you're asking, Carter? Grayson has connections everywhere, politicians, law enforcement, judges. If we move forward with this, there's no going back." Emma straightened her shoulders, her voice firm. "Then we do it the right way. We take this to the state authorities, bypass his influence here. We have a chance to stop him once and for all." Miller studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right, let's do it." Within hours, a team of state investigators arrived at the station. Emma handed over the evidence, walking them through every detail of the case. Thor, Luna, and Rex stayed by her side, their calm presence a source of strength as she relived the harrowing events of the past few days. By the time the investigators left, the wheels were in motion. Arrest warrants were issued and Grayson's properties were placed under surveillance. But Emma knew the fight wasn't over yet. Grayson wouldn't go down without a fight. That night, Emma visited Michael in the hospital. He looked stronger than he had the day before, his color returning and his voice steadier. Thor, Luna, and Rex immediately jumped onto the bed, their tails wagging furiously as they greeted him. "Easy, guys," Michael said with a laugh, his hands reaching out to scratch their ears. "I missed you too." Emma smiled at the sight. "They never gave up on you. If it weren't for them, we might never have found you." Michael's expression grew serious. "I owe them my life, and I owe you too. Thank you, Emma, for everything." "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "Just focus on getting better. We've got this." Michael nodded, his gaze drifting to the dogs. "They've always been more than just pets to me. They're family." The following morning, the news broke. Robert Grayson had been arrested. The evidence Emma had provided was enough to dismantle his operation, and several of his associates were taken into custody as well. The community buzzed with shock and relief as the full scope of Grayson's crimes came to light. Emma stood outside the station, watching as reporters swarmed the building. She felt a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion, knowing the case was far from over, but grateful for the progress they had made. Thor, Luna, and Rex stood beside her, their calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the chaos around them. "You three are famous now," she said with a small smile. Rex barked happily, while Luna nudged her leg gently. Thor remained stoic, his steady presence grounding her. In the days that followed, life began to return to a sense of normalcy. Michael was discharged from the hospital and returned home, where Thor, Luna, and Rex greeted him with boundless enthusiasm. Emma visited often, checking in on both Michael and the dogs, who had become an integral part of her life. One evening, as they sat on Michael's porch watching the sunset, he turned to Emma with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," he said. "Those three, they're more than just heroes. They're partners, and I think they've taken a liking to you." Emma raised an eyebrow. "What are you saying, Michael?" "I'm saying maybe it's time they split their duties," he said with a smile. "They can stay with me, of course, but if you ever need them, they're yours." Emma looked at the dogs, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I think they've already decided that." In the months that followed, Emma continued to work in the town, earning the respect of her colleagues and the trust of the community. Michael began to rebuild his life, using his experiences to advocate for others who'd been silenced by corruption. And Thor, Luna, and Rex, they became local legends, known not just for their bravery, but for their unwavering loyalty and love. As Emma stood outside her home one quiet evening, watching the dogs play in the yard, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. They had been through so much together, but they had come out stronger on the other side. "You're not just heroes," she said softly. "You're family." Thor trotted over, his eyes warm as he pressed his head against her hand. Emma smiled, her heart full. The future was uncertain, but with her newfound family by her side, she knew she could face anything.